PowerPoint I'll take you through.
Oh,
I'm
great.
sorry.
What is that one called?
So this is the PowerPoint is called Study Committee Comparison of Other States' Laws. Very original title.
Thank you.
So I'll share my screen with everyone again.
And we're gonna go for probably a little bit more than an hour. And the idea is for us to be drawing inspiration about what is possible after learning sort of what our boundaries were within federal law.
And we do have some additional time this afternoon if we start running a little close to 12 here, because I imagine that is likely to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I've changed the color for this one so you can distinguish it from the other one. So this is green, the other one was orange. I'm trying to keep sort of early fall theme going here. I don't know what I'll do when we meet in stick season. So we're going to kind of look at a couple of things. We'll start, again, same order as we went through before. We'll start with discussion of trust fund solvency. We'll move on to a discussion of benefits. Then we'll move on to some examples for waiver reduction of periods of disqualification and benefit overpayments. And then finally, we'll move on to sort of the issues around reimbursable employers. Some of this stuff we've already discussed, but hopefully this will spark some more ideas and questions and we can move through it. And again, you do have the 50 state handouts on benefits and reimbursable employers. You have the federal guide on designing a solvent trust fund financing mechanism. There are also 2 trust fund solvency reports for 2020 and 2021 that I've included on the webpage. Those are from the USDOL, and they look again at that average high cost multiple and how states are doing. And we're gonna look at some snapshots from that, but they drill down for all 50 states plus the territories that have UI systems. So you can look more specifically at what's happening in each state. And that will hopefully provide some additional sort of insight into this, or at least raise some additional questions that you can ask Joyce and Matt Barowitz and the department and other witnesses as you're going on and trying to figure out the trust fund issues. So again, let's start revisiting the average high cost multiple. The USDOL frequently uses this to analyze the solvency of a state's trust fund. We've talked about the formula before. It's the trust fund balance divided by total wages over the average high cost rate. So, and again, the average high cost rate is the average of the 3 worst years in the last 20. And so what it's basically intended to do is reflect a potential future high benefit cost while minimizing the impact of a single, especially high year like 2020. And we've done that in our own formula by just simply saying, don't look at 2020. So, and again, as I mentioned before, 1.0 is considered by USDOL to be an adequate level of solvency. Based on experience and other things, you may agree or disagree with that. So that's their sort of baseline, but it doesn't have to be where we end up. So looking at this chart here,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but just this formulas are pretty new to me. 1.0 sort of is based on an assumption that we could cover a really bad year, right?
It means we could cover an average recession with what we have in the trust fund now.
But of course, even during a recession, people are still contributing to the fund. And so,
yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make
sure
I had that on.
You'll get a sense of how this works out or how this worked out for Vermont with the next 2 slides. And I apologize because the charts here have I took these directly from USDOL. They are very small, but there, the green arrow is Vermont. Up at the very top, we had, I believe it was 2.53 was our average high cost multiple. So well above the dotted line, which is the 1.0 rating. So that kind of gives you a sense, like the baseline of 1.0, most states were above that going into the pandemic. Vermont was way above it. We had the healthiest trust fund in the country, according to that metric. So as we go into 2021, though, you see where Vermont has dropped to now. If you look at the green arrow again, and we're now below that baseline. So we dropped to, I think, about 0.85, 0.86. Again, I apologize, this is so small because of this. You can see a number of states at the bottom, starting with West Virginia and going down to California, all went into borrowing. So they have no money in their trust fund. And very few states kept an average high cost multiple above 1.0. So in the course of that 1 year of the pandemic, Vermont went from about 2.5 to about 0.85, which means that we burned through about 1.6, 1.7 times an average high cost multiple of 1.6 or 1.7, even though we had money coming into the trust fund. I see a question.
Joyce, will you have more information about this? I'm just kind of interested as how did the states above us stay at such a high rate in their trust fund compared to what we experience? And I know there's going to be variables there, but you know, depending on what benefits are, how many people, all of that, but
That's something we can dive into a lot more next meeting.
Yeah, and you have both of the year's reports here. It won't really give you the background answer. Those reports won't give you that sort of background. Why did, I think Oregon is the top here. Why did Oregon do so well? If we look back, they were second to us the year before, and they stayed up at the top. Why did they manage to do that when Vermont fell so far? A big part of it is probably related to the hit our economy took from the pandemic versus the hit their economy took. Right. So some of this is going to be the political decision to close down the economy. You know, the governor's emergency order shutting things down. Some of this is going to be the nature of our economy. You know, how does Vermont's economy, with its heavy emphasis on tourism and hospitality, differ from Oregon's economy, which still has tourism and hospitality, but it may play a lesser role? And did that impact those numbers? Are there other things in the system that impacted it? So there are a number of things, but we can probably get some answers from the statutes, and some of it's just going to be the nature of where we are versus where they are.
I think it'd be interesting to understand too is, you know, how much money was deposited into the trust fund the prior year, comparing it to 2020, to give us an idea of, you know, the loss of wages that are used to compute how much money is going into the trust fund. So when you have all the, you know, basically most of the workers were not working, nothing's being paid on their wages. How did that, you know, that must have contributed quite a bit too.
Right. And another thing to just remember for Vermont is we started 2020 at tax schedule 2 and we dropped to tax schedule 1 on July 1. So we've had the 2 lowest tax schedules when this happened.
Yeah.
And our benefits increased on July 1. So we saw benefits going up. Not only were workers dropping out of the economy, so there were less wages to pay taxes on, but then tax rates were also dropping. So all of those things could serve to impact how we got to this number. And we don't know, we can find out some of the factors for Oregon, but we probably can't answer all of them. And I'm sure Joyce may be able to find out more from the sort of economist standpoint of why were states impacted differently by the pandemic, what were some of the factors.
Oregon a second.
So,
Yeah.
in addition to this chart, we saw a lot of numbers from Matt and Joyce on projections going forward that were much more current than this historical point in time, based upon certain assumptions.
Right.
And we were looking at the trust fund in 10 years being over $1 billion, again being, if nothing went unchanged, probably being one of the healthiest in the country again. And then we made some policy changes to increase benefits and to lower taxes, and we still were projected to have $600 million in the trust fund, which was more than we've ever had. So I assume that in addition, or more important than being this being sobering news, we need to look at projections based upon our statutes now and where they're likely to lead us, as opposed to just reacting to something like this.
Right, that brings up a really important point. These are two snapshots in time. And the way these reports are set up, they give you a January 1 snapshot each year. They don't tell you what's happening throughout the rest of the year. They don't tell you about how certain economies have seasonal fluctuations that are different from other economies. It is one thing they talk about in the financing, the sort of designing your financing model piece that I've posted on the website, is that depending on when you do your look to determine your average high cost multiple or whatever factor you use, there are seasonal fluctuations. So if you do it in what is a 1.0 on December 31st, might be a 1.1 on July 1 because of seasonal fluctuations and unemployment, where it tends to spike over the winter in a lot of states, and then it's lower in the summertime. So there are various factors there that you might want to, that come into play. And then, like you said, the other piece that this doesn't look at is what's the fund projected to get to on December 31st of next year and the year after and the year after. And for some of these states, it may not be projected to move right back up. For Vermont, we may be right above that 1.0 dotted line already. I just don't know, but that's, again, this is just a snapshot, and it's just kind of a picture of, like, that's what a particularly bad year did. And that's really the context that I'm providing it as. That was just the example of the hit a bad year could provide, even though the multiple of 1.0 is supposed to be, sort of the goal that the feds have provided for an average year.
And Joyce and Matt are working together to get some much better projections for us as we do some modeling and have more of a sense of where we want to be going so we can understand the impacts. One thing I noticed here before we go on is that, Vermont dropped and we were all, and that's concerning. It's still, a third of the states were negative.
Yes.
And Oregon stayed near the top, and there was curiosity about how Maine also somehow went up in the rankings, which seems bizarre and shocking, but that might just be an anomaly that we can.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to keep in mind too is if you look at this, when you look at the one from 2020, the scale is from 0 to 3. So it covers a bigger scale.
That's so sneaky.
And it's from 0 to 2 for 2021. So Oregon and Maine and Wyoming look like they stayed really strong, but the overall numbers may have actually changed. The print is just too small for me to read that. The other thing too to keep in mind is the average high cost multiple here is now taking into account 2020. So that number is changing for states because that's a dynamic number too. It's not static. It now has the worst year that anyone can remember in terms of unemployment experience being included in those 3 worst years. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that probably edged up and states were edging down even if some states stayed above that level, it doesn't mean that they stayed just as strong. All right, so this brings me to sort of the historical relationship between pre-recession average high cost multiple and borrowing. I alluded to this earlier. What it basically shows, and it looks from recessions 74 to 76, 80 to 84, which actually includes 2 recessions. There was an 81 recession and then another one in 82 and 83, 90 to 92, 2001 to 2004, and then 2008, 2010. It looks at where states were in terms of their pre-recession multiple, and then how many of them had to borrow. It varies from recession to recession. You can see that the 90 to 92 recession was pretty mild. Many fewer states had to borrow in that recession. Same thing with 2001 to 2004, it was relatively mild. But then if you look at the numbers here, over, I've kind of put the cursor over it here, there's a 1.0 plus and then a less than 1.0 for each recession. And so if you look at those columns, for states that were above 1 or at 1 or above, in the minority of those states had to borrow in each recession, and in one instance, none of them had to borrow, the 90 to 92 recession. For states that were below 1.0, depending on the recession, for the more severe recessions in 2008, 2010, 80 to 84, and 74 to 76, you were seeing the vast majority and sometimes 100% had to borrow. And then for the milder recessions, a little under 50% had to borrow. But overall, across those years, you're seeing 88% of states with the balance below the 1.0 had to borrow, while 32% did not. As you start to break out into the I was just looking at 2008, 2010 for the 88%, but you can see breaking out, there's 100%, 89%, 30, 30, and 88% for the folks who are below 1.0. As you get more into the nitty gritty, you can see that the higher your multiple gets in general, the lower the rate of borrowing, with a minor anomaly in the 2008 to 2010 recession, where 1 of 2 states in that 1.75 to 1.99 had to borrow. Again, this is just sort of giving you some historical experience. It would be interesting to see what happens with the 2020, 2021 in terms of this chart and what that experience is looking like, but I don't think we have a conclusive answer yet, because we're still in the process of hopefully coming out of this.
Can you just repeat again, if you have to borrow, what's the downside of the state in borrowing? And an interest cost, I assume.
You pay interest on the loan,
Right.
in general, and you also potentially, if you can't pay the interest off and your loan balance stays outstanding for a while, your employers potentially take a tax hit. And over time, that can become quite severe. It's a 6% hit year over year over year.
But the interest doesn't come from the trust fund. The general fund has to pay.
That's right. You can't pay the interest out of the trust fund. That's another important factor to keep in mind. And there are restrictions on using trust fund dollars for paying off any of it. And it's not something I know all the details on, but the interest you have to pay out of general fund dollars. So that's a hit to the state budget as well. And if you're borrowing enough, that can be a really significant hit, especially for a small state like Vermont.
Why? I'm assuming the only reason you would borrow is in order to cover payments.
It's a cash flow loan, basically, to keep covering the benefits that are due because you don't have enough money.
And so these states that had a relatively, were not under 1, was it just a short term, for part of the year, maybe they dipped down, or can you help me?
I don't know. I don't know the full context on that. I mean, for some of them, it may be they had a healthy balance, but they also had an industry that was hit particularly hard by the recession. You know, if you're a state that's heavy in manufacturing and it's a recession that hit manufacturing the hardest, you may have an enormous demand for unemployment benefits without jobs for those people because their skill set no longer has jobs available to it in the workplace. And so you have people who are on unemployment for a long period of time versus another state economy where maybe they're less heavily impacted. They bounce back faster. You have people on unemployment for less time, more taxes coming in, et cetera. There are other factors too. I mean, if you have a tax system like we do, where it'll fluctuate depending on the balance, you may have an anomaly like we had where the recession timed itself. So it hit right as we were dropping to the lowest tax rate. And that could be a temporary borrowing situation.
Yeah.
There, you know, if our balance had been a few $100 million lower, so if we'd set that target lower, we could have been in a situation where we are low tax rates and ran into the red, and then the tax rates bounced back and we came out of it. But for, you know, a year or 9 months, we had to borrow to pay benefits.
Thank you.
If I remember correctly, in the 2008-10, federal government provided these loans interest-free for 1 or 2 years. And then if you were still in the red and hadn't paid it back yet, then interest started to accumulate after that.
Yeah, and there are 2 things to kind of keep in mind here. One, there are a lot of nitty-gritty details about borrowing that I just haven't taken the time to familiarize myself with. And 2, with every big recession, there seems to be some congressional measures to either provide additional benefits or tax relief or both to in relation to unemployment. And so the rules do get bent and possibly change temporarily, and then you may come back. So there is always the possibility that you could see lower borrowing in one of these recessions because Congress did bail out or suspended suspended some of the rules or provided some supplement to the states to keep them from going into the red. Or in other cases, a lot of states may have borrowed, but they may not have paid as much interest because Congress suspended interest payments temporarily. Other questions on that? Okay. All right, so multiple factors to consider when we're thinking about UI financing systems. We talked about a lot of this. So taxable wage base, this varies enormously from state to state. So the federal wage base is 7,000, and that's the base that states start at. As we talked about earlier, our taxable wage base is 14,100. Some states have a taxable wage base of up to about $50,000. So this varies enormously. Every state is equal to or greater than the feds because of the tax credit issue. But beyond that, it's up to the state. And this really kind of gets to how you're targeting your taxes. A lower taxable wage base hits all employers fairly equally. A higher taxable wage base will mean that seasonal employers might end up, they're going to be, they're going to be taxed on everything, but then you're extending the taxes to year-round employers more heavily. Because, so imagine I've got a bunch of seasonal workers, I pay $12,000. I'm paying taxes on their wages regardless. But if I'm an employer with a lot of year-round employees earning $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 in Vermont, after we get to 14,100, I'm no longer paying UI taxes on those employees. If you raise that taxable wage base, now my tax burden has gone up relative to where it was before. So that's kind of the impact there with taxable wage base. The flip side of this is that a larger taxable wage base potentially allows you to set a lower tax rate. And it's the same thing as we run into with property taxes all the time. Towns with higher property values can have the same tax rate, but generate a lot more revenue from those taxes than towns with low property values. So that's a good way to think about taxable wage base. The next piece is tax schedule. I'm going to go into that a little deeper, but it's basically, you know, do you have one rate? Do you have 5 rates? Do you have 10? How are you setting up those schedules of taxes? And do you have different schedules that you move to? There are various approaches to this from states. We'll look at 2 of them. And then we can dig down more if there are specific approaches members of the panel want to look at. The next is your experience rating system. Vermont uses one of 4 models out there. We'll talk about those models, their benefits and drawbacks. This just a very big caveat before we get to that. This is the kind of thing that is one of those massive systemic changes. If you change the way we experience rate, it affects everyone. So it's something that if you're looking at it as a possible way to address some of the financing issues, just know that there's a lot of potential impacts, some of which might not be intended, and they will reach everyone who pays unemployment insurance. The UI benefit structure, this is a big one because it's money in versus money out. So if you have a particularly generous benefit structure, you need a strong tax base to fund that and keep the fund solvent. And then finally, state economy. This is something where, again, it's sort of the same as that property tax issue. If you have a really strong state economy with really high levels of employment and high wages, you can generate a lot of revenue. If you have a smaller state economy with lower wages, maybe a lot of seasonal employment or part-time employment, you may not be able to generate those revenues regardless of where you set the tax rate. And that's just something to keep in mind because we are a small state with a lot of seasonal businesses or smaller businesses that have part-time employees and so forth, which makes us different from like a California or a Massachusetts or New York, who may be able to generate a lot more with a different financing system. Okay, so let's look at taxable wage base. We've talked about this a little bit. This is just an example. So 5% on a taxable wage base of 15,000 results in 750 in contributions. If you change the taxable wage base to 37,500, you can get the same level of contributions with a 2% tax. So what does that mean? What it means is that if you're an employer with a lot of part-time employees who aren't going to be earning more than like 15 or 20,000 in a year, your taxes will actually drop. But if you're an employer with a lot more full-time employees or higher wage employees, your taxes will stay the same, even though the rate is lower here. Important thing to keep in mind here is that if your economy is heavily weighted to one side or the other, that the sort of raw rate here might need to change because you may not be able to generate as much if you have, for example, a lot of low wage workers in your economy. And with Vermont, this is something that Joyce and Matt can talk to you more about. If you're considering moving the taxable wage base, how would that impact our employers? We do have an enormous number of small businesses in the state, much higher proportion than a lot of other larger states have. So like I said before, wage bases range from $7,000 to around $50,000 depending on the state. We're currently at 14,100. And as I mentioned this morning, we're indexed to the percentage increase in the state average weekly wage, which is means that our wage base isn't eroding over time with inflation. We do have those the anomalous features though, where when our tax schedule drops to Schedule 3 and Schedule 1, we reduce that wage base too, which provides additional tax savings to employers, but may have some unanticipated consequences for our trust fund or consequences that we want to explore further. So again, not that it's a good or bad thing, but if there is sort of the balance of tax benefits versus the solvency of the trust fund.
Is there a supplemental document that goes through all the states and their taxable wage base?
I can photocopy a chart from here, and the federal DOL may update that annually. I have to look. They have a highlights chart which updates benefits annually, and I think it updates minimum and maximum tax rates and wage base as well. If it does, I'll send the committee a link and have Mike post it. Because
Photocopies are good too.
Yeah, and otherwise I'll scan the information from here, which is 2 years old. So all right, so next we talked about tax schedules earlier. So multiple tax schedules basically allow you to raise taxes to replenish the trust fund when it's low, and then reduce taxes when the fund has achieved an adequate balance. So this kind of balances maintaining solvency with reducing burden on the employers in the economy when your fund has reached an adequate level of solvency. The number can vary significantly from state to state. So some states might have 3, Vermont has 5, Rhode Island has 9. So you see this great variation. And so that's something to consider here, because it allows for some smoothing of tax rates, which we can see on this chart here. So if you look at Vermont here, I put the 5 tax schedules along the left-hand column. And so at the minimum rate, you're jumping 0.2, 0.2, 0.3, 0.2 from schedule to schedule. If you contrast that to Rhode Island, which has 9 schedules, at the minimum rate, you're jumping 0.19, 0.1, 0.1, 0.1, 0.2, 0.2, 0.1, and then staying flat. So they have sort of a smoother increase. Again, looking at the high tax schedules, obviously Rhode Island's tax rates are very different than ours. They start at 7.4% for their maximum rate versus 5.4 for us. But they jump from 7.4 to 10 in 9 steps or in 8 steps, and we jump from 5.4 to 8.4 in 4 steps. So they're jumping, they're making a smaller leap in more steps than Vermont is. So this is just one of those things here where each step is pretty significant in Vermont. In Rhode Island, I'm not saying that these won't be a significant hit to some businesses, but they're less substantial jumps in many cases. So again, the caveat here is Rhode Island has a very different experience rating system and a very different tax structure from us. These are just examples of the rates that are set across their array versus across ours. They also, you'll notice here, the median rate for us is number 10 of 20. And for Rhode Island, it's number 14 of 28 possible buckets that people fit into on that array. So in Vermont, you have no experience, no benefit experience attributable to you. You're in class 0. And then as you get benefit experience attributable to you, you get put in either class 1 through class 20, depending on where you rank. In Rhode Island, you get ranked from the very bottom to the 28th piece, and they use a reserve ratio, and so that's based on it. Basically, it looks at if you imagine that each employer has a separate account, what's the reserves in the employer's account versus the benefits paid out. So if you go negative, you get to the highest tax rate. So you paid out more benefits than you paid contributions. If you're positive, meaning you paid more contributions than benefits, you get the lower tax rates. And so their array is different, but it has 28 steps. So even within the tax classes there, there's smaller steps for employers. All right. This is an alternative approach in Missouri. Missouri has a single tax schedule for regular employers that is adjusted when the balance of the UI trust fund drops to certain levels. So when their balance is between 400 and 450 million, they get a 10% surcharge on top of their base tax rate. When it's between 350 and 400 million, that goes up to 20%. And when they're below 350 million, it's a 30% surcharge on the tax rate. So the tax rate climbs by 30%. A couple of things to note with Rhode Island. Again, I'm not advocating for this. There are potential problems here. One is that they've set fixed balances. So
You mean Missouri?
Missouri, I'm sorry, thank you. Missouri has set fixed balances here for its triggers, meaning that over time with inflation, that 350 million may become less and less likely to hit. And again, the other thing to consider here is having a single tax schedule with just these sort of solvency surcharges on it. What that means is that their tax schedule, if they get a really healthy trust fund, they're also not getting the relief that you might get in Vermont or Rhode Island in terms of tax relief once you've reached that level of health. But it is another model that I wanted to just kind of present to the committee as an alternative. So it is a much simpler model, but it has potential drawbacks both when the economy is healthy or when or in the future. In many ways, like it's kind of like the minimum wage before we indexed for inflation. It won't continue to maintain a constant value.
I think you may want to change where the decimal point is on this chart, because you have it at 450,000.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. That is a typo. Thank you. You didn't catch that when I was proofreading last night. I apologize. Okay. Is it okay with everyone if I move on to experience rating? Great. All right, so Vermont utilizes what's called a benefit ratio formula to determine experience rating. 19 states utilize this formula. So earlier I said 35, I was mistaken. Benefit ratio equals benefits charged divided by the employer's payroll. So basically, what's the amount of benefits chargeable to you as an employer versus your payroll? That's how we look at it in Vermont. Reserve ratio is used by 28 states in DC. And what this does is it basically says contributions minus benefits charged. This is the way Rhode Island does it. So you're looking at, as an employer, have you paid enough into the trust fund to actually cover what's been spent to pay the benefits that are attributable to you?
So they're looking, there's no pause on that. So if you have a 40-year-old company, are they looking at 40 years of experience?
It's going to depend by state. So you have to look at least 3 years of experience. And this is where, again, the variations could come in. So you could see a lifetime experience, which would address the issue of small employers in Vermont who have one layoff in 15 years. And it sends under our plan or our model, that will send their tax rate sky high for 3 years until that layoff drops off, especially if the individual is unemployed for 26 weeks. Under the reserve ratio formula, if your look back is long enough for that employer, you might be able to say, well, they paid in, $50,000 in contributions over 15 years, and they had $25,000 in benefits go out. So they still have a positive reserve ratio, and they're still entitled to a relatively low rate, even though it might climb a little bit. There are benefits and drawbacks to each formula. But these are sort of the two main formulas that are used. And Vermont just happens to be a benefit ratio state. I'm not sure why we chose to go that way in the beginning, but it's been that way for a very long time at this point. And this is again, potentially a system-wide change. If we decided to change this here, it could impact tax rates for a lot of different employers, both good and bad. So the next is a benefit wage ratio. This is really a minority sort of formula. It looks like at the proportion of an employee's benefit wages to the total taxable wages. Or proportion of an employer's benefit wages to their total taxable wages. It's similar to a benefit ratio, but it's looking at the total taxable wages and the benefit wages that were paid. So basically, I've had 2 employees laid off. They earned $50,000 in wages in their base periods from me. My total taxable wages in that base period were $200,000. So my ratio is 0.25. And that's basically how they rank employers there, is they're looking at what percentage of your payroll did you lay off from that base period. So it's similar to the benefit ratio, but not identical. The last one is a payroll variation plan, which looks at the decline in an employer's payroll from quarter to quarter. Only Alaska does this. The potential with this plan here is it basically is looking at, what's your taxable payroll, and if it starts dropping, your taxes start increasing, because they're saying you're basically laying off employers, but it's not looking at your actual attributable benefits. So it's basically looking at one factor that can be in there, but it could inadvertently hit employers who have seasonal fluctuations in employment and so forth. They could see fluctuations from quarter to quarter in their tax rates. And that would actually, potentially raise the cost of business, even if those employees are not going on to the benefit rolls.
So is that how Alaska is getting to the negative balance employers?
That's a good question. I think with that one, you're not necessarily. So I'm trying not to be too opinionated here, but I think the danger here is that you have employers who are not necessarily negative balance employers, but they have negative payroll variation. And so it looks like they are potentially having big layoffs, but it is just, I'm a ski resort and these people work for me in the winter, and then in the summertime, they have a different job. And they're not necessarily going on unemployment. And so there's not necessarily any benefits going out that are attributable to me. And versus on the other hand, you could have, a business where they lay off 50 people, and that's a legitimate benefit cost. But this is kind of getting at it with a very simple, broad focus, rather than looking at benefits going out. The difficulty with the 3 formulas that look at benefits going out is how you attribute the benefits. Because then you run into the issue that we've talked about already, which is, so I'm in the base period and I paid 80% of the base period wages, but I'm not responsible for the unemployment because they switched jobs and got laid off. Or alternatively, I only employed this individual for 3 weeks and then I laid them off, but I'm responsible for 100% of their wages if you do the most recent employer model, even though their prior employer paid most of the wages that are responsible for their benefit.
And in the Alaska scenario, someone could lay off most of their workers, hire an entirely new set of workers, and not experience any impact on their rate.
Yeah, if your payroll doesn't vary, that's also a potential issue. So yeah, it's a very broad sort of tool, and I think that's why only one state has employed it. is it's a very broad and simplistic measure, and for whatever reason, Alaska's decided to keep it, but it doesn't actually, it's a measure of experience, but it's not necessarily very accurate. Okay, are we ready to move on to benefits? Okay. So first thing, there's a lot of things to consider when we look at benefits. The first is, of course, the wage replacement rate. This is the, Vermont's about 57%. Some states are as high as 65 to 70%. A lot of states are around 50 to 52. This is your sort of top line thing that everyone looks at, but it's only one factor. The next is max benefit amount. A number of states will have fairly high wage replacement, but a low max. And that can have a significant impact because it means that lower wage workers are going to take advantage of that high wage replacement. But then after a certain cutoff, you're seeing diminishing returns for everyone else who's on unemployment. That could be positive or negative depending on how you look at it. But it's that can be a significant factor in how generous the benefits actually are, and who they're targeted at. Indexing for inflation, this is another thing to keep in mind. The wage replacement rate is tied to the earnings of the individual in their base period. The maximum benefit amount can be indexed to inflation for the state, to a sort of annual figure that you come up with, or it can be set at a flat amount, like $450. Indexing for inflation means that benefits aren't eroding over time. So what it basically means is that what you enact today is going to be essentially the same value for someone 10 years from now. Vermont has this. We're indexed at 57% of the state average weekly wage. With the exceptions after this year that amount can't decrease. We added that to the statute this year because of the possibility of negative fluctuations in that.
When do the benefits change? July 1st or January 1st?
Yeah, Vermont benefits and tax rate change on July 1st. Wage base, taxable wage base changes on January 1st.
So if somebody gets benefits in June and July, if the maximum goes up and they're subject to the maximum, their benefit will go up.
That's correct.
What about somebody who's not subject to the maximum? Do they get an inflationary increase come July?
No, they will continue to receive that roughly 58%
Of their base period wages.
of their base period wages. Yep. So it's only if you're at that maximum benefit when you get to that increase in July where you might see a bump. Dependent allowances are the next piece. These can have, depending on the state, everything from a very meager effect to a very significant effect on your benefits. The low is, I believe, Pennsylvania, where they allow $5 a week for the first dependent and $3 for the second, with no more than $8 total. And then the high, I can't remember which state is the high, but some states will allow you to collect up to a few $100s in additional benefits if you have enough dependents. So this is only a factor in a minority of states that have added dependent allowances. Other things to keep in mind here are, and you'll see this on your chart to some extent, or actually I'll talk about this later, but dependent allowances are on the chart for the benefits. But in states like New Jersey, you can have a large dependent allowance, but if you're already against the maximum weekly benefit, you can't add above that. So you're still capped. Other states allow you to go over that maximum with the dependent allowance. And then again, state economic factors. This is a big one. So in Vermont, we have relatively high wage replacement rate relative to a lot of other states. But our benefits, our max benefits are lower than some states because we don't have the wage levels that those states do. So if they're also pegged to their average weekly wage, they're going to end up with a much higher max than we do. So equal earners earning the same thing, we may be replacing more, but once you get up to that cap, other states you may see a max like Massachusetts is 150 something, 55, I think. And that's a function of the fact that they just have a much higher average wage for their workers than we do in Vermont. Okay, so 11 states have a wage replacement rate of 50%. The remaining states have rates that are either below or above that amount. Examples of high wage replacement rates include Oregon at 65%, New Jersey at 60%, and Georgia and Hawaii at approximately 61.9%. So not necessarily states that you would expect, but these are examples of some of the higher wage replacement rates. A very significant number of states, I don't have an exact count, have replacement rates that are between 50 and 52%, 50.5%, 51, 52. The reason I don't have an exact count is because for so many states, it's a formula where you take the average of 1 or 2 or 4 quarters, and then you divide by a certain factor. And I just didn't have time to do the math on every state. Vermont's wage replacement rate is approximately 57.8% of your average weekly wage over those 2 quarters. And it's, obviously this could be more or less than 57% of your wages in certain weeks in your base period. Maximum weekly benefits range from a low of $235 a week in Mississippi to a high of $855 in Massachusetts. This information dates back to January 1, so those amounts may have changed slightly, but that gives you a good idea of the range. Many states index the maximum weekly benefit amount to the state average weekly wage or a similar figure. That ranges from 47.6% in Texas to 70% in Hawaii. So that kind of gives you an idea of how the high benefits can range, even if they're indexed and fixed to a relatively standard number. Another thing too, so in other states it's fixed by statute. Something to keep in mind here, apart from that indexing prevents erosion of benefits, it also means that they're strongly influenced by the state economic factors and how the state calculates its average weekly wage. A good example of this is 66.67% of the average weekly wage in South Carolina ends up as $326, but in Pennsylvania it's $583. And I don't think that's all economic factors there. I think you're also looking at how their systems calculate that wage. And so that's also a factor to keep in mind. And the bottom line for all this is it makes it very hard to do an apples to apples comparison of benefits from one state to the next. So, we may hear that Massachusetts has a very high maximum benefit, but we have a higher wage replacement rate. So there is a give and take in these factors. And some states may have a high wage replacement rate, but a low max, et cetera. So these are all things to consider in setting up the system. And let's see. So just touching on dependent allowances quickly, and then I'll take questions on benefits. 13 states provide a dependent allowance in addition to regular benefits. The calculation methods include a fixed amount per dependent, like Pennsylvania, where it's $5 and $3, a percentage of a claimant's weekly benefit amount, or increases in the wage replacement formula for claimants with dependents. So in Iowa, what they do is, and this is in your chart, but I think the base wage replacement amount, if you have no dependents, is you divide by 23. And then if you have one dependent, you divide by 22, 2 or 3, you divide by 21. And then more than that, you divide by 20. So you're basically, instead of adding a fixed amount, they're changing your percentage of wage replacement. So that's another way to approach it. Other states do some sort of hybrid where they say $15 or 5%, whichever is greater or whichever is less. So there are different ways to approach this. And then again, like I mentioned before, the other thing is the cap. In some states, it's the number. You can have 1 or 2 dependents, or maybe Maine allows you an unlimited amount up to 50% of your weekly benefit amount. The next is a percentage of weekly benefits. So that's Maine there, 50%. And some like New Jersey, it's the max weekly benefit. So you can get this dependent allowance, but you can't go above that max. So this is just another factor. It's a way to provide some progression in the way benefits are provided depending on expenses, or at least what we would anticipate as expenses for a household. I have not found any states that provide sort of a progressive wage replacement. So at lower wages, you get 60%, and then you get 55, and then you get 50. I didn't find any examples of that. I also didn't find anything in the federal statutes that would prevent us from doing that. That being said, given my recent experience with the USDOL, I would want to double and triple check with them that would be permissible under federal statute, and that I'm not missing something that is in there. So if that was a direction the committee decided to go in, it is worth noting that by setting a max, you are in some ways setting sort of a 2-tier system. Folks earning below the wages necessary to get the max get the full wage replacement. Folks earning above that get reduced wage replacement. But that kind of gives you just a general sense of the factors out there. The 50-state summary gives you a much better sense of what states are doing for how they set their wage replacement rate, where their maxes are. Is it tied to the state average weekly wage? And if so, what's that percentage? And then are they adding some sort of additional dependent allowance on top of that to try to target the wage replacement a little bit more?
Are states with dependent allowances, I'm just going to assume the dependent is defined differently in different states, and I don't need specific ways that it's defined at this point. My other question is, how is the cost of that sort of socialized across experience ratings?
So that's a good question. I believe that those dependent allowances need to be chargeable or attributable to the employer. But I can double check that for the states, but I believe that these are attributable. My understanding is that benefits coming out of the trust fund need to be attributed to an employer's experience rating. But again, I'll double check to see if you have to attribute dependent allowances. So.
I can imagine a scenario where we would create further incentive to discriminate against parents in the workforce. Any other questions about all of that?
Yeah, it is worth noting that dependent allowances in a lot of states include, for example, a disabled spouse or an adult child or relative who you're responsible for who can't work. But it does depend by states. In pretty much every state, it includes minor children. And then beyond that, it can vary. You'll see, for example, in Illinois, you get 17.6% of your average weekly wage for a dependent child and 9% for a dependent spouse. So they get different dependent allowances depending on whether it's a dependent spouse or a dependent child.
They must have a great computer system. Anyone, sorry, getting too close to lunch. Anyone have any other questions? I think it might make sense to pause here.
We can start up with the.
Given what we're doing right after lunch.
After the
Yeah.
discussion after lunch.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
That works for me.
Anyone have any questions or just even things you would want to name that we want to know more about at this point before we move on to thinking about something else?
Just one thing that Damien said, you talked about ability to 60%, 62%. Are you talking about dependencies or are you talking about in general benefits?
In general benefits, so the index regular benefits, depending on some sort of measure of your prior wages or your, you could hypothetically, and again, I couldn't find anything on whether or not this is permissible in the federal model, but you could say benefits up to $200 are replaced at 65%. Benefits from 200 to 400 are replaced at 60%. I'm not sure how you would structure it, so you don't get some really extreme benefits cliffs in there. But theoretically, you could try to structure a system where you have sort of progression, so people are getting lower wage replacements somehow get a higher benefit, so it's closer to what they need to live. The potential issues I see with it are how do you set it up so you don't get some extreme benefits cliffs, and so it's easy to administer. What do you use to measure that? Is it just their base period earnings? Is it what their benefits going to work out to? And then the third one, sort of the big question is there some issue with the federal law that I didn't see when I was reviewing it, but that exists, where they're going to say you're treating beneficiaries differently? That's the one I'm most concerned about, is you're treating beneficiaries differently based on that, and that's not permissible. So that's kind of where there are some big questions for me. Cameron or the commissioner might have more information or might have experience with questions about that have come up among other states that are looking at changing their benefits. Not sure how often states really look at this issue. It's, unemployment insurance is one of those systems where you tend not to spend much time on it unless something's broken.
Yeah. I think when you're looking at percentages of benefits, then or percentage of wages, your higher wage earners are bringing home obviously more money. And that 38% reduction in your wages to a low wage earner, a minimum wage earner, is much more significant to them than it is to someone that earns a higher wage. And is there a way that we can balance that a little bit so that the low wage earners actually have enough money to live on? And especially in a scenario that we just went through where there's no jobs available. I think the only other option for them is to get onto state benefits as well. So, and I don't know how difficult that is when you're receiving unemployment benefits at the same time. So I just think it'd be interesting to explore that. Is there a way that we can, help lower wage earners sustain themselves while they find another job?
Yeah, I'll continue to look into it, but I think these would also be good questions for the department, and certainly on the issues of benefits while you're receiving unemployment. Some of the advocates may be able to give some real practical experience with the challenges or not that people have faced in trying to do that. And I don't know all the considerations that gets into my colleague Katie's area when you're just starting to talk about reach up and SNAP benefits and so forth.
But I think that's probably something that we should understand better too, for the lower wage earners, of how difficult is it for them to receive the unemployment and then also get onto some benefits to help them through until they find another job.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Okay. Thank you very much.
Great.